A crisp winter morning hovered over London Heathrow Airport, where the usual hustle of travelers filled the terminals. Passengers dragged their bags, some lost in their phones, others hurrying to catch their flights. Amid this crowd, young Eleanor Windsor, just 9 years old, stepped out of a sleek black SUV. Despite her casual outfit, her presence carried a quiet regality that was unmistakable. She was en route to a charity event in Edinburgh, looking forward to meeting children from across the country. Yet, no one in the bustling airport seemed to recognize her immediately. Dressed simply in a navy blue jacket and white sneakers, Eleanor looked every bit the child she was. Her parents, Prince Alexander and Duchess Catherine, had always made a conscious effort to ensure their children experienced as much normalcy as possible despite their royal status. But today, Eleanor was stepping into a world where the boundaries of normalcy didn't quite exist, and she hadn't anticipated just how indifferent the airport staff would be to her presence. She approached the terminal confidently, but with slight hesitation in her step. Though accustomed to public attention, Eleanor had learned early on to carry herself with grace, never demanding recognition, but always maintaining the quiet dignity expected of her lineage. She clutched her ticket tightly, her excitement for the trip mixing with the unease that large, unfamiliar spaces often brought. Her path led her to the check-in counter, where a young staff member named Sarah was stationed. Having just started her shift, Sarah was ready to handle the usual airport rush, but nothing prepared her for the peculiar situation about to unfold. "Next, please," Sarah called, scanning the terminal for the next passenger. Eleanor stepped up, offering a polite smile, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "Good morning," she greeted quietly. "Morning," Sarah responded without looking up from the computer screen. "How can I help you today?" Eleanor slid her ticket across the counter, her eyes briefly scanning the boarding pass before focusing back on Sarah. The staff member picked up the ticket, barely glancing at the name, but her attention was quickly caught by the royal crest embossed on the top. She raised an eyebrow. "Is this your ticket?" Sarah asked, her tone flat. Eleanor nodded, her cheeks warming slightly at the questioning tone. "Can I see some identification?" Sarah continued, her eyes narrowing as she studied Eleanor's face and the ticket in her hand. Eleanor hesitated. Should she mention her title? Would that make things worse? She wasn't sure how to handle the situation, but politeness had been instilled in her since childhood. Taking a deep breath, she smiled again. "I don't have my ID with me, but that's my ticket," she said softly. "I'm Eleanor Windsor." There was a brief silence as Sarah processed what she had just heard. "Eleanor Windsor," she repeated, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to confirm this." Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah turned to her colleague, a middle-aged man named Frank, and whispered something. Frank looked over at Eleanor, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece something together. The two exchanged glances that Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. "Sorry, Mississippi," Sarah said after a long pause, her voice noticeably colder. "We need to verify this before proceeding. It's unusual for a child to be traveling alone in business class." Eleanor's heart sank. She was used to the skepticism, but it still stung. She tried to remain composed, just as her parents had taught her, but she couldn't ignore the way she was being scrutinized. Minutes passed as Sarah typed something into the computer, conversing with Frank in hushed tones. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood quietly, scanning the terminal, hoping anyone, would recognize her, but no one did. Finally, Sarah turned back to her. "I'm afraid I'll have to escort you to a holding area," she said firmly. "We need to confirm payment for your seat." Eleanor's stomach twisted in frustration. "But it's my seat," she protested quietly. Sarah, however, had already signaled for a colleague to step forward. "Please follow me," the staff member instructed, eager to move things along. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. She glanced around the terminal again, searching for any sign of familiarity. But the bustling crowd remained oblivious. She was just a small girl in a navy blue jacket, alone in an airport, facing scrutiny she had never expected. Her mind raced with thoughts of her parents, who were likely unaware of what was happening. They had told her this trip was important, a chance for her to step out on her own and make a difference. But now, it felt like she was being treated as an inconvenience rather than a passenger. She followed the staff member down a hallway toward a small side room. The walls were stark white, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Unlike the busy terminal, this space was cold and sterile. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had been subjected to security checks before, but nothing like this. Just as she was about to speak up, the door swung open, and another staff member entered. His name tag read George. He was the supervisor. George took one look at Eleanor, then at her boarding pass, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for the delay," he said in a clipped tone, "but we can't process your boarding pass without further confirmation. The system flagged your ticket, and we need to verify its legitimacy. My parents are expecting me in Edinburgh," Eleanor said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. George sighed. "I'll have to call someone to verify the payment. It won't take long, but we can't let anyone board without proper confirmation." Eleanor nodded, though inside, frustration churned. She didn't want to cause a scene, but the longer she stood in this sterile room, the more out of place she felt. Time dragged on. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Just as Eleanor began to think she would be stuck here indefinitely, the door opened once more. But this time, it wasn't another staff member. It was a familiar presence. Standing before her was none other than King Edward II, her grandfather. The moment King Edward entered the room, the staff froze. It was as if time itself had stopped. Eleanor's frustration melted into relief at the sight of her grandfather. She hadn't expected him to be at the airport today, but his presence immediately shifted the power dynamics in the room. "What seems to be the issue here?" King Edward asked, his voice calm yet commanding. The staff scrambled, clearly flustered. Sarah, the young staff member who had first questioned Eleanor, stammered, "Why, Your Majesty? There's been a mix-up. We were just verifying the ticket." King Edward raised an eyebrow. "A mix-up?" He glanced at Eleanor. "This is my granddaughter, Eleanor Windsor. I trust she has been treated with the respect she deserves." A heavy silence filled the room. The realization of their mistake dawned on the staff like a crashing wave. They had unknowingly detained a member of the royal family. The supervisor quickly cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we deeply apologize for the misunderstanding. We'll correct this immediately." King Edward's gaze remained firm. "See that you do." Within moments, the situation was resolved. Eleanor was handed her boarding pass with a profuse apology. As she walked toward the gate alongside her grandfather, she reflected on the experience. It had been frustrating, even embarrassing, but it had also taught her a valuable lesson. Respect isn't about who recognizes you, it's about how you carry yourself. And with that, Eleanor Windsor stepped onto her flight, more determined than ever to leave her mark on the world.